Kelly, do you know where the bodies are?
I plead the fifth.
There is someone who knows where the bodies are. The gravedigger.
Oh, okay.
There are places for our dead, places of peace and not dread, sites of simple or elaborate stones that memorialize our lost ones' bones. Welcome to Stones and Bones. Whoa, welcome to Stones and Bones. Whoa.
Gravediggers have a special place in our hearts, obviously. Our pseudo-mascot, Mort, is a gravedigger.
Wait, I'm relegated to a mascot. I'm not running around in a big fluffy costume dancing around here.
Oh, Mort.
For centuries, gravediggers have been stigmatized because of their association with the dead, which makes them seem soiled. But the truth is, we need gravediggers. They perform a very important and needed task and have literally risked their lives to the benefit of the rest of humanity through the centuries.
Clearly, grave digging goes all the way back to ancient times, but the first formal grave diggers were the Roman Vespellones, who would carry out the dead bodies of the poor at night for burial. Sometimes the word was also used for grave robbers. And you could see how grave diggers and grave robbers, those two jobs, might overlap each other a little bit. Because again, you know where the bodies are, you know who you buried, so you know who to go get later. Possibly. The Vespellones not only dug the graves and buried the bodies, but they also led the funeral processions with the bodies. The dead were carried on a bier by Vespellones. There were usually 4 of them. The wealthy were placed on bigger biers and had up to 8 Vespellones. So I guess more money, more carriers? I don't know. Doesn't mean that you were heavier, so you needed more people to carry you. The Vespellones could be the deceased nearest male family members or his male friends. Now, Vespellones were considered pagan. Christians in Rome had the fosser. This is from the Latin fossorius, which translates roughly to digger. Fossers were grave diggers in the Roman catacombs in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. Fossers were held in more esteem than the Vespellones because they were considered part of the clergy of the church. So if you had that, you had a little bit more clout, I guess you could say. Now, they were an inferior part of the clergy, but still higher than the Vespellones, although they didn't get a regular salary, at least not at first. Townspeople would pay them per individual job. So if you came to the church, you needed a family member buried, the fosser would take care of that, and then the family would pay the fosser directly rather than having it be a church kind of thing, even though they were still considered a part of the clergy. Later, they would be paid from the church treasury. Then fossers became businessmen, and we would say they were probably the early form of a funeral director because they started selling burial plots. They were like, hey, we can make some more money here other than just digging the grave. Why don't we sell it too?
In more recent times, in small communities, grave digging was usually done by the family members of the deceased person, but later became the traditional duty of a sexton. Sextons were in charge of the maintenance of church buildings and thus the churchyards outside of them as well. And when cemeteries became public places of burial, separated from a church, the sexton was in charge of overseeing the town's public burying ground. The word sexton comes from the Latin word sacristanus, meaning custodian of sacred objects.
I kind of like that because if you think they're taking care of dead bodies too, that the dead people were sacred as well. Now, of course, in our modern era, many times the digging of graves is left to landscape maintenance workers. The pickaxes and the shovels have given way to backhoes, so now the jobs become much, much easier. But there are some cemeteries that still do the hand digging, and in the past, what they would do is build these wooden boxes, put them together right next to wherever this burial site would be. And they would put the dirt from the grave into the box, cover it with a tarpaulin, and then wait until after the coffin is lowered into the ground, and then take the dirt out of the box, put it back into the ground, and then dismantle the box and, set it up again for the next place. Although I think anybody who's been to a graveside memorial knows that sometimes they just pile the dirt up right there. They don't put it in a separate box and then just put a tarp over it there. You've probably seen it done both ways. But traditionally, they would make this box in order to put it there. And they would also place artificial turf around the grave during a graveside service to, keep the hole the way it needs to be, so that it holds up and doesn't cave in or what have you. Gravediggers dig down at least 3 feet from the surface, but traditionally 6 feet is the standard as a carryover from the days of the plague. So you don't really need to dig somebody down 6 feet under, but because they wanted to make sure they put people deep enough to prevent any sickness from spreading, people have kind of stayed with that number.
Unless, of course, you have a high water table,
That's true.
because then they'll pop up like a cork.
That is true. So even 6 feet may not be enough. 3 feet definitely isn't enough. And that's why in places like New Orleans or when you're in an island area, you'll see people who are buried above the ground for that reason. Another carryover from the time of the plague are mass graves. Gravediggers faced high mortality rates as they buried infectious bodies, and there were so many bodies that individual graves just weren't practical. During the plague, prisoners were often used to dig the mass graves because they needed more workers, and of course, with prisoners, you can force them to do it. Gravediggers not only faced death during the plague, but in several countries, they were considered more dreadful than the plague. The gravediggers known as monadi in Italy, ravens in France, and mortis in Russia were considered very, very dreadful. And here's one of the reasons why. For example, the monadi took pleasure in their duties, so they would wear bells because they knew it would strike dread in those around them. So if you heard the bells coming and they're coming near your house, what are you going to think, Kelly?
They're coming to get me, ha ha, hee hee, ho ho. I know, that's the funny farm.
Well, not much of a difference for some people. I'm going to get taken over to the plague hospital because a lot of the time the monadi weren't just taking out dead bodies. They would be taking you to the plague hospital.
Gotcha.
So they're coming to take you no matter what. And probably more than likely going to be burying you. So you'll be like, am I almost dead? Is that what they're trying to say? In the 1926 book, The Black Death, written by Johannes Knoll, he writes, "It was terrible for the survivors to see the monadi dragging the corpses of the dead along the ground, fearful to hear no other bells than those worn by these monsters on their legs." Kelly, have you seen Monty Python's The Holy Grail?
Of course.
Many of our listeners probably have as well. And you guys probably all remember there's this scene of a monadi ringing a bell and dragging a cart as he's yelling, "Bring out your dead, ding, 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 bring out your dead." And then one dude says he isn't quite dead yet. So he's like, "I'm not quite dead yet." And then they club him. Well, apparently this is from real life. They weren't just
no.
making this up for the movie. The monadi would do these kinds of things. If someone was sick but not quite ready to die, they would grab that individual anyway because they didn't want to have to make a return trip. So let's say they came to get the guy's wife who is dead, but he's sick and gonna die eventually. We'll just take him at the same time because we don't have to come back out here.
Oh my gosh.
So was he quite dead when they put him in mass grave? Who knows? Talk about getting buried alive. They would even go into homes with healthy people and demand money. And if the people in the home didn't give them money, they would haul them off to the plague hospital. So talk about like an early form of blackmail, I guess you could say. Give us some money or we're going to take you away.
Good grief. Being buried properly with loved ones has been a part of every culture and important. War is a time when the burying of the dead has to be approached in a different manner. April Slaughter and Troy Taylor share in their book Disconnected from Death, The Evolution of Funerary Customs and the Unmasking of Death in America.
This is a great book. It talks all about different death customs and such. And I wanted to share this. They write, Civil War soldiers worried deeply about their own remains, especially as they began to encounter circumstances that made customary reverence anything but possible. A South Carolina man dying on the Virginia front wrote that his greatest hope was to be transported home. Jeremiah Gage of the 11th Mississippi felt differently. As he was dying at Gettysburg, he wrote to urge his mother not to regret that she would be unable to retrieve his body. With his last words, he asked, "To be buried like my comrades, but deep, boys, deep, so the beast won't get me." Confederate Thomas J. Key had the same gruesome concern. It is dreadful to contemplate being killed on the field of battle without a kind hand to hide one's remains from the eyes of the world or the gnawing of animals and buzzards. Another Union soldier expressed a different worry with his final words, "Don't let the rebels get me." To be returned home to one's family, or failing that, at least to be honorably buried with one's comrades and preserved from desecration by enemies, human and otherwise, were concerns shared by soldiers on both sides clearly. When the war began, military officials on both sides sought to establish some sort of burial procedures, in no small part because decaying corpses and the effluvia that emanated from them were believed to pose serious risks to public health. And so, in this case, many of the burials would take place by military officials. They found themselves being gravediggers because they had to do something with all of these bodies.
And the problem with finding gravediggers continued at a couple of the prominent cemeteries where Confederate dead were buried. Joy M. Geiger writes in her book, Pleasure Grounds of Death.
Even as Hollywood and Oakwood cemeteries increased the amount of space available for the burial of soldiers, the matter of securing enough labor to bury the dead remained a chronic problem, and this is during the Civil War. The Richmond Dispatch chastised the lack of attention given to the corpses piling up at Oakwood in July 1862, where, quote, "no less than 40 or 50 coffins with their ghastly contents were exposed to the sweltering rays of the July sun.
Yikes.
The lids in many instances being forced off by the swollen bodies, emitting a most offensive effluvia." William Henry Hurlburt, a northern traveler to Richmond, employed similar language when he witnessed in Hollywood Cemetery piles of reeking coffins left lying in the summer sun for hours together, till the scanty force employed by these ghouls of the government could find time to shovel their human spoil decently out of sight. At Oakwood Cemetery, at least several of the gravediggers were enslaved African Americans, and in the face of struggles to keep up with the burial of the war's dead, their labor was at times supplemented by Union prisoners of war. And it just goes on to say that overflowing as they were with both buried and unburied corpses during the war, it was nearly impossible for these cemeteries to maintain their appeal to casual visitors as places of respite and exercise. So, Kelly, not a place that we would really want to go traversing through. But as you can see, here we're talking about plagues and now war. It's just hard to find enough people to bury the dead. And so they were using enslaved people to do it, and also kind of whoever they could grab. Grave digging wasn't just for men. Many women took on the task as well. The Order of the Good Death shares about a 20-year-old woman named Miss Kincaid, who took on the job of establishing the first cemetery in the town of Lindsay, California. She took care of the grounds and kept track of the burial records, and she dug the graves, because no man would step forward when they were trying to sell the plot. They're like, okay, he wants to buy the plot and manage it. And no man would do it, so she's like, I'll do it. And then I love this, Kelly. Here is a picture of Josephine Smith, and this is what the Australian Gazette shares about her. Mrs. Smith is aged 84. She looks darn good for 84, standing in a grave here, whose hobby is digging graves and keeping the cemetery tidy. She believed there was a right way and a wrong way to dig a grave. She likes sandy soil the best and has gone many times at midnight for a rush job. It usually takes her 8 hours to dig a grave. She's 84 and digging graves. And she quite likes to work at night when it's cooler. She always drinks a bottle of stout after each grave. And who wouldn't? She's like, I'm a little hot and
Indeed.
tired. Bring me some beer.
That's hilarious. The sexton and gravedigger make many appearances in art and writing. The first appearances were in pictures near the entrances to underground cemeteries. The oldest fresco with Fossers is believed to be one found at the Sacrament Chapels in the catacomb of St. Callistus. They are pictured keeping some people out of the cemetery during a commemoration of martyrs who were unauthorized. This was another of their duties. There is Hablot Knight's Brown's drawing found in the Pickwick Papers from 1837 entitled The Goblin and the Sexton. and Victor Vaznetsov's 1871 Gravedigger.
2 gravediggers make an appearance in Shakespeare, Kelly.
They do?
Yeah, I mean, hey, let's have them as main characters for a little bit. They're in a play. It's actually Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet. They appear in Act 5, Scene 1. So it opens with the gravediggers digging a grave for Ophelia and wondering between the two of them if she should be given a Christian burial because anybody who's read Hamlet knows she's unalived herself. So the first gravedigger sends his partner off to get some liquor from a local pub, and he continues digging and he sings while he's doing this. So he really enjoys his job there. Hamlet comes along and hears the gravedigger singing and asks his friend Horatio, has this fellow no feeling of his business that he sings at grave making? It's like, what? Who sings while they're digging a grave? Shouldn't you be solemn and sour or dour face or something? So the gravedigger and Hamlet have a conversation about the work and how long it takes a body to rot. According to the gravedigger's expertise, he responds, faith, if he be not rotten before a die, as we have many syphilitic corpses that will scarce hold up to the bearing, he will last you some 8 year or 9 year. A tanner will last you 9 year. Hamlet wants to know why a tanner would last longer, and the gravedigger points out that his business has probably tanned his own skin, so it would be harder for water to get in.
Okay.
I don't know if they wore gloves when they were, doing the leather thing, and if not, maybe it would cause you to be a little bit more tough.
This interesting narrative comes from Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. Apparently, the cemetery had established a rule that women couldn't enter the cemetery unescorted. Women pushed back on this in 1840, and the Sun reported a story in which a group of women wanted to enter, and the sexton attempted to stop them from entering, and after much arguing back and forth, he felt forced to relent and let them enter. This was such a big deal, it made it in the paper.
I mean, they reported it, so clearly they were like, wow, this is big news. Those women are causing a kerfuffle outside of the cemetery. They demand to be let in.
And the same thing happened again a few days later, but this time the sexton was having none of it, and the women were refused entry.
The Sun seemed to argue against the rule, writing, if the gates be thrown open to all, such ladies as our correspondent might sometimes find themselves brought into the neighborhood of undesirable company, but that regulations that will give greater freedom of admission and avoid this unpleasant circumstance would no doubt give great satisfaction to all respectable people. So they're like, just throw open the doors so we don't have this issue happening out in front of the cemetery. We know there might be some undesirable company inside, but let them in. Then it continued to explain that it was hard for women to get a male escort during the week because men were working, and if they want to go have their little picnic at the graveyard, how are you going to do it? Because there's no men to go with you. And then it also pointed out that maybe the ladies wanted to escape male company for a while.
True.
So they wouldn't want the men to be with them. So I liked the points that the paper was trying to make. But during the antebellum era, it was like, egad, a woman wants to enter a cemetery alone? What's wrong with you? That being said, Greenmount Cemetery did have issues. As we mentioned earlier, Joy Giguere wrote the book Pleasure Grounds of Death, and I want to share this from that. What complicated matters for the ladies of Baltimore, however, was a series of violent exchanges between men of various social classes within the cemetery's enclosure, which further highlighted the experimental nature and at times social instability of these new institutions. In May 1841, the Sun reported with dismay on 2, quote, violent and rather riotous occurrences that were deeply disgraceful and highly reprehensible. The first fracas occurred between 2 Irish gravediggers and a group of several rowdies, in which the shovels of the gravediggers were freely exercised.
Ooh.
So it's kind of like we had a sword fight going on, but it's, with their shovels. You grab a shovel, I'll grab a shovel, and we'll go after each other. And then, Kelly, I have this great book. I think a listener sent this to us, but I can't remember who. It's the Victorian Book of the Dead. And it was edited and compiled by Chris Woodyard. And it has a lot of newspaper accounts from back during the Victorian era about different topics that have to do with death and death culture. And it had several things in here for gravediggers that I wanted to share. It says, like undertakers, gravediggers were thought to be grim and superstitious men albeit with a touch of gallows humor about them, like the bantering gravediggers in Hamlet, which we just talked about. The Arizona Republic reported on July 20th, 1906, "Grave digging is not a gay business," said a gravedigger, "but it is a very old one, and many curious superstitions surround it. One of there is never to buy a new spade. To dig a grave with a spade that is new is supposed to bring death in the family within a 12-month. So if you don't have your old shovel, you do not want to go to the store and get a new one. Hence, gravediggers buy their spades secondhand as a rule. Another superstition with some is that a grave should never stand open overnight. And why is that, Kelly? Because somebody's going to come along after they've
Fall
murdered
into it.
Well, that could happen. Somebody could fall in, but I mean, I'm into true crime. So are you.
True, true.
Where's a great place to hide a body?
In a freshly dug grave.
Exactly. You just put it in there and throw some more dirt on it and go. They'll put the coffin on top and they'll never know there's a body in there.
You've been thinking about that far too much, I think.
It should not, they say, be dug till the day of the funeral. If it is made the day before, beware. There is a third superstition that if a cock crows once while a grave is being dug, one friend of the digger will die. If it crows twice, two will die. If thrice, three.
Good grief.
So let me just say, don't be a friend with a gravedigger, possibly. That would keep you from dying. Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio, was very conscious of its position as the resting place of many eminent people, such as Salmon P. Chase, Levi Coffin, Joseph Hooker, Dr. Daniel Drake, and a host of politicians and military men. Uncharacteristically for an interview with a gravedigger, there isn't the slightest hint of humor, just a bureaucrat's account of the services performed by the gravediggers and the public health benefits they provide. One suspects that this soberly informative article was crafted as a public relations exercise to uphold the dignity of the cemetery. So it has in all caps at the top, "The Gravedigger, His Cheerful Life in the Cemetery, an occupation which few men care to follow, the manner in which the work of interment is performed. The gravedigger has a thankless job. His position is not envied by anyone, for he's always seeing the most painful side of life, mourning our beloved dead. One of Shakespeare's most amusing characters is the gravedigger in Hamlet, and the terrible sadness of the scene is relieved by the cheerful jokes of the men engaged in preparing the fair Ophelia's grave. There are 7 gravediggers in Spring Grove Cemetery who attend to the interment of all bodies sent there. John Trotter, the boss of the men, has been a professional gravedigger for 18 years in that city of the dead. He's a man 47 years old and a funeral ordinary, has no more call on his feelings than on the marble monuments which mark the resting places of the wealthy and illustrious. It's a very busy time. Just now at Spring Grove, the bodies which have accumulated in the public vault during the past 4 months must be buried before the 1st of April. 4 weeks ago, nearly 100 coffins of various sizes filled the great stone vault. On Wednesday, the number had dropped to 30, and on Thursday, 10 of the corpses were buried. Trotter, who is designated as the sexton rather than by the hard title of chief gravedigger, doesn't like to talk about graves and burying people. Not that the matter is particularly disagreeable, but rather on account of his belief that the subject is distasteful to the friends who have sorrowfully laid their departed away. Under the careful eye of John Trotter, who never permits any awkwardness on the part of his subordinates. So I guess he keeps all of his gravediggers in line. Mr. Trotter is an unmarried gentleman entirely and enthusiastically devoted to his occupation, the superintendent of the cemetery. Mr. Solway, who has done so much to improve and beautify the grounds, has great confidence in Trotter, and the interments are always properly attended to. Graves and grave digging is not a cheerful topic, remarked Mr. Solway, but I am willing to impart any information desired. So the question is, how many styles of graves are there in this cemetery? 3. The plain grave where no box is used and the coffin is covered up with earth, the box grave in which a pine box encloses the casket, and the brick grave. Of these, the box grave is used in about 65% of the burials, the plain in 15%, and the brick in 20%. It is very horrifying to most people to put their dead right in the earth, but that is only a foolish sentimentality. The sooner the body returns to dust, the better. It is a proper error that bodies are eaten by worms after being buried. That is another error, for the worms that would feed on human flesh do not exist 2 feet below the surface. I can't see any use in preserving bodies, but the wishes of lot holders are, of course, respected in every instance. The graves are all 6 feet deep, and there is considerable knack required in digging them. Some days we open as high as a dozen, and again there will only be 2 or 3. Many heaps of dirt dotted the cemetery at intervals, and the information was given that 10 bodies would be buried. from the vault the next day without counting those which would be interred by regular funerals. I suppose you witness some very harrowing scenes sometimes, was suggested to Mr. Salway. Yes, indeed, but we must attend to our business just the same. The gravediggers are not callous to human grief. Trotter has told me that he often turns his head away on account of the dreadful agony of some daughter or wife. Occasionally, a frantic relative of the dead attempts to jump in the grave, but that's a rare occurrence. Women frequently faint at the sight of the grave. The gravediggers make a little more money than ordinary day labor. It takes them about an hour to dig a plain grave, but sometime longer to prepare a brick grave. Twice a day, a messenger sent out from the office of the cemetery in this city with an order for graves. This order recites the name of the person to be buried, the lot and location of the grave, when the burial is to take place, and the cause of death. No one who's died of a contagious disease can be put in the public vault, and the consequence is that no matter what time of the year or how disagreeable the weather, it's interred the instant the coffin reaches a cemetery. Anyone who has many acquaintances can go into Spring Grove, and he will be pained and surprised to see the number of people whom he formerly knew now reposing in eternal sleep. The gravedigger's occupation is far from being unhealthy to him. He is constantly in the open air, and most of the diggers at the various burying grounds around Cincinnati have been engaged in the work for years. And Kelly, sometimes it was necessary in the cemeteries for the gravediggers to work as security. So after the sun would go down, they would be armed with pistols and clubs and generally accompanied by trained and savage bloodhounds to keep people out of the cemeteries.
Wow.
Probably, we don't want any grave robbing.
Right.
An old watchman at Glenwood Cemetery explained this to a Times reporter yesterday by saying that in all probability, the soldiers detailed at the grave were not picked. Take half a dozen men from any walk of life, he continued, and place them at night to watch graveyards, and the chances are that in a short time, 5 of the 6 will feel like retiring permanently to a lunatic asylum. Needless to say, it was a pretty thankless job.
Now, let's talk some famous gravediggers.
Okay.
There was a legend around Rod Stewart that he had been a gravedigger, but apparently he had just been employed at Highgate Cemetery to mark graves and do grounds care. He didn't actually dig any graves. He said of this, "The popular myth arose when I happily rode along with that I was once a gravedigger. It's a delicious, mysterious piece of backstory, but again, we must move to strike it from the record." So that's a bummer. But there are other musicians who took a shovel to dirt to dig graves.
Yeah, wouldn't that be cool to think that Rod Stewart would be out there crooning in the graveyard as he's digging a grave? I like that he thought it was something to add to his resume that would be cool.
Yeah, he just went along with it.
Yeah, how dare people say that I was digging graves? And he worked at Highgate Cemetery. Hello. One of the best cemeteries in the world.
Hello.
James Sonny Ford Thomas was born near Eden, Mississippi in 1926 and became a major figure in the evolution of the Delta style of blues music. He was a frequent player at the juke joints, and he wrote and sang songs about life in the Delta. He passed away in 1993. Thomas had learned to play guitar from his uncle when he was 8, and that uncle also taught him to sculpt from clay. He loved to create sculptures of animals found in the Delta, and he also made skulls so he could scare his grandfather. He's a kid. He's like, what else could I make with this? There were also creations that he made that represented the beliefs of the African American folk spirituality known as hoodoo, which is something that he believed in. From 1961 to 1971, Thomas worked as a gravedigger, and then he started making sculptures to accurately represent the dead, which he was seeing a lot of, and he would use items like real teeth and dentures.
Yeesh.
So these things are really creepy looking. I'll put one up here for you guys. And you have to wonder, where was he getting the teeth and dentures from? If he's working in the graveyard?
The dead bodies, duh.
I'm wondering.
Duh.
I don't know where else he would be getting them from.
Unless he had a friend who was a dentist.
Maybe. Inspired by his time as a gravedigger, Thomas said, "We all end up in the clay." So it was very poignant that he would sculpt things from clay, and then he said, "We all go back to clay."
Joe Strummer was a co-founder and lead vocalist of the punk rock band The Clash. Strummer worked as a part-time gravedigger at St. Wollos Cemetery in Newport, Wales in 1973. John Jackson was born in 1924 in Virginia, and he learned to play the guitar when he was young. He was an American Piedmont blues musician. That Piedmont refers to a unique style of fingerpicking on the guitar. He moved to Fairfax, Virginia in his 20s and worked as a gravedigger as he developed his music.
I'm beginning to think that grave digging inspires you to be musical.
Maybe.
Then there's Dave Vanian of the British punk goth rock band The Damned. The Damned were a pioneer punk group, being the first in Britain to release a single and were a major influence on the goth subculture. Vanian was the lead singer and he loved to wear vampire-themed costumes. The group is still releasing great music, Kelly, and they're still really cool, even though they're all in their 60s. I just watched a video they made a couple years ago for the new album that they had released, and I was like, dang, they all still look like they're punk rockers and they're in their 60s.
Nice.
Vanian worked as a gravedigger before forming the group. His work doing that inspired him to change his name from David Lett to David Vanian, like Transylvanian. Then there's Tom Petty. Did you know that he did some grave digging?
I had no idea.
He, of course, is of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He worked briefly as a gravedigger. In the music video for Mary Jane's Last Dance, Petty plays a morgue assistant who takes a dead woman home with him and dresses her in a wedding gown and has dinner with her and dances with her, and then he throws her in the ocean. This was inspired by his earlier work in a funeral home, and he also worked as a gravedigger for that funeral home. Actor and comedian Nathan Barnett was a gravedigger for 2 years prior to moving to Los Angeles. And British author Sid Smith worked as a journalist for 17 years before his first novel was released, and he worked briefly as a gravedigger to make ends meet.
Detroit Tiger baseball player Richie Hebner had the nickname the Gravedigger, and this was because he actually worked on the side as a gravedigger. He told Vintage Detroit, "I started digging graves as a high school sophomore for my father, who managed a couple of cemeteries, and I did it for 35 years. It was pocket money and it was good exercise, but we also did it when the ground was frozen and it was snowing and sleeting."
Yuck.
Let me tell you, I buried a lot of people over the years. I'd go back to spring training and the guys would ask, "You really bury people?" Some guys got the heebie-jeebies. I said, "Yeah, they don't move. You dig a hole, you put them in, fill it back up, and go home." This one time, a grieving widow fell into the hole and she got stuck.
Oh my.
My brother Dennis says to the rabbi, "Let's leave her there and give the family a 2-for-1 special."
Oh no.
It's terrible.
There's that gallows humor.
Yeah. I don't think that went over too big. Hebner continued to dig graves after he retired from playing.
British serial killer Peter Sutcliffe claimed that it was during his time as a gravedigger that he was inspired to kill sex workers. He was a gravedigger in the 1960s, and during his trial, Sutcliffe claimed that he heard voices that ordered him to kill sex workers coming from the headstone of a Polish man named Bronislaw Sapolsky. Sutcliffe thought the voice was from God. Yes, because I'm sure he would be telling you to kill sex workers. And if it's coming from a tombstone. And finally, President Abraham Lincoln worked as a sexton in a churchyard in Spencer County, Indiana.
I didn't know that either.
I didn't either. Most people don't because it's not well known and it's not really out there. But apparently there was a supplement to the Philadelphia Public Ledger that was published on February 15th, 1931, and it featured a large illustration and an article discussing whether young Abraham Lincoln took care of Pigeon Baptist Church. This was a church his family attended, and it had a cemetery. The article discusses a letter written to a Kansas City newspaper by Reverend Caleb A. Obenshain, who claimed to have visited the Pigeon Baptist Church building in 1866, and he found an old account book with a young Lincoln signature as sexton in it.
Wow.
If he was young, why would he do that? Because everybody's like, no, he didn't do that kind of work. He was a lawyer and doing that kind of stuff and working in politics and everything. But when he was younger, he signed a book as the sexton at that church. According to his letter, Reverend Obenshain put the book back where he found it, and then the book disappeared when the church was torn down some years later. So there are those who say that Lincoln never worked as a gravedigger, but this account seems to show that he did.
Grave digging would have been a tough job back in the day when plots had to be hand dug. This job became even harder when the numbers of dead skyrocketed during wars and epidemics. People don't generally think about gravediggers and just how important that job has always been. How these men and women have protected the community from disease and put their loved ones to a final rest respectfully. Gravediggers could be said to be experts on stones and bones.
Indeed. That was so interesting. I wanted to know more about gravediggers, and I figured the listeners would enjoy that as well. What'd you think, Mort?
That was fascinating, but of course, I already knew how amazing we gravediggers are.
Of course you did, Mort.
Because Mort knows
Everything.
I want to thank you all for joining us on this Stones and Bones. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
Stones and bones.